The oxygen recyclers died on the morning of week 5, and the colony had 18 hours of breathable air remaining. Zijin heard the alarm first, and she was already moving before most of the other colonists had opened their eyes, and she was running calculations in her head as she made her way to the life support center. The 3 cubs followed her because they always followed her now, and they had become her shadow and her purpose and her reason to keep fighting. Commander Dravith met her at the life support station, and his face was grim, and she could see the fear he was trying to hide behind his professional mask. "The primary recycler is completely dead," he reported, "and the backup system cannot handle the load for more than 18 hours. "What about the emergency shuttle?" Seojin asked. "It has its own life support system." Dravith's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting. "We could jury-rig the shuttle's recyclers to supplement the colony system," he said slowly. "It might give us enough air to last until rescue arrives, but someone would have to operate it manually from inside the shuttle." Seojin said, "The systems are not designed for remote control." She did not mention that the shuttle was in the external hangar where the heating had failed completely, and that whoever stayed inside would be trapped in an unheated, cramped space for the entire duration. Dravith understood anyway, and his expression shifted to something like horror. "Your hands are still damaged," he said. "Your ribs are still healing, and you cannot possibly survive another 18 hours in extreme cold." "I have survived worse," Seojin said, and she started walking toward the hangar. Dravith caught her arm, and she stopped and turned to look at him. "Let me do it," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something precious. "You have given enough, and it is time for me to learn what you have been trying to teach me." Seojin searched his face, and she saw that he meant it, and she saw that he had finally understood. "Those cubs need to see their leader come back," she said gently. "They need to see the person who changed and who learned and who became better. They need to see you come back," Dravith argued. "You are their mother." "Now, exactly," Seojin said. "And a mother does whatever it takes to keep her children safe." She pulled her arm free, and she kept walking. The cubs caught up with her at the hangar entrance, and Tevu grabbed her hand with both of his small, clawed ones. "Please," he said, and his voice broke on the word. "Please do not go." Seojin knelt down so she could look him in the eyes, and she placed her bandaged hand against his cheek. "I have to," she said, "but I need you to be brave for your sisters while I am gone." "You always say that," Tavu said, and tears were streaming down his fur. "You always say be brave, and then you go and break yourself for us." "That is what mothers do," Seojin said. "We break so our children do not have to." She hugged each of the cubs in turn, and she breathed in their scent, and she memorized the feel of their small bodies against hers. Then she entered the shuttle, and she sealed the door behind her, and she got to work. The cold hit her immediately, and it was like stepping into a freezer, and her breath came out in thick white clouds that hung in the air. She found the life support controls, and she began the process of connecting the shuttle's recyclers to the colony's main system, and her damaged fingers fumbled with the controls, and every movement sent pain shooting through her healing ribs. 1 hour passed, and then 2, and the temperature inside the shuttle dropped lower and lower. Seojin's hands went numb first, and then her feet, and then her face, and she worked by memory and instinct when she could no longer feel what she was touching outside the shuttle. The colony's air quality stabilized, and the colonists began to breathe easier, and the crisis passed from immediate to merely desperate. Dravith stood at the hangar window, and he watched the shuttle, and he thought about everything Seojin had taught him without ever saying a word. The cubs waited beside him, and they pressed their faces against the glass, and they whispered encouragements that Seojin could not hear. 18 hours later, the rescue ships docked with the colony, and the rescue teams poured through the airlocks with medical equipment and supplies, and the colonists wept with relief. The first place Dravith led them was the shuttle. They found Seojin unconscious and hypothermic, and her hands were frozen to the controls, and she had held on until the very last moment. The medical team worked frantically to revive her, and they pumped warm fluids into her veins, and they wrapped her in heated blankets, and they fought for her life with everything they had. She survived. The Karani doctors marveled at her resilience, and they said that no, Karani could have endured what she had endured, and they looked at her with something like awe in their eyes. 6 months later, on the Karani homeworld, Seojin stood before the High Council in the Great Chamber, where the most important decisions of the Confederacy were made. Hands still bore the scars of frostbite, and her shoulders still ached on cold days, and she walked with a slight limp from the nerve damage in her feet. But she stood tall and proud, and beside her stood 3 cubs, who were now officially her children under Karani. Lautavu stepped forward to address the council, and his voice echoed through the ancient chamber. "Honored council members," he said, "I come before you today to speak of humans." He paused and he gathered his thoughts, and he remembered everything he had witnessed in that frozen colony. When the day was there, and he gathered his thoughts, and he remembered everything he's thought, witnessed in that frozen colony. When the crisis began, I was told that humans were fragile, he continued. I was told they were sentimental and weak, and that their compassion was a liability. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But I watched a human woman break her body again and again to protect children who were not her own, and I listened to her bones crack through a communicator, and I saw her give away her food until she nearly starved. He looked at Seojin, and his eyes shone with love and pride. Humans are fragile, yes, and they break more easily than we do, but they break for others, and they put their bodies between danger and the innocent. And they do not stop fighting until there is nothing left of them to give. He turned back to the council. That is not weakness, he said. That is the greatest strength I've ever seen. The council voted unanimously that day to grant humanity full alliance status with the Karani Confederacy. The news spread across the galaxy, and other species began to look at humans differently. And they began to understand what the Karani had learned in Blood and Ice and Broken Bones. 1 year later, Tevu submitted his application to the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, and his essay spoke of bridges between species and of understanding built through sacrifice. He was accepted immediately. On the day he left for the academy, he found Seojin in the garden of their home, and she was teaching Haniel how to braid hair in the human style, and both of them were laughing. He watched from the doorway for a long moment, and he remembered the promise he had whispered in that frozen colony so long ago. He had sworn that no human would ever stand alone as she had done, and now he would spend his life making that promise real. "I am leaving now, Mother," he called out. Sanjin looked up, and she smiled, and her face was older now and marked with scars, but her eyes were still warm and fierce and full of love. "Make us proud," she said. "I already have," Tevu replied. "You taught me how." He walked away into his future, and behind him his family watched, and the galaxy stretched out before him, vast and full of possibility. The cracks in a human's bones had become the foundation of something greater than any of them had imagined, and the whispered promise of 3 frightened cubs had grown into a force that would change the stars forever. Week 4 of the crisis, and the colony was surviving, but barely, and the tension among the survivors had grown thick enough to cut with a blade. Seojin was healing slowly, and her shoulder still ached when she moved it wrong, and her ribs sent sharp stabs of pain through her chest when she coughed, and her fingers remained stiff and clumsy from the frostbite damage. She could no longer seal bulkheads or repair conduits or do any of the heavy work that had earned her extra rations before under Commander Dravath's system. This meant she was now classified as a non-contributing member of the colony, and her food allocation was cut in half. The irony was not lost on anyone that the woman who had saved them all was now being punished for the injuries she had suffered in doing so. Seojin accepted the reduced rations without complaint, because she had never been one to feel sorry for herself, and she simply began eating less and giving what she could to others who needed it more. The cubs watched her grow thinner, and they watched the light in her eyes grow dimmer, and they whispered among themselves in the corner of the hub, where they had made their home. Tavu had a plan, and he had been working on it for days, and now it was time to put it into action. Commander Dravith called an assembly meeting to announce new rationing restrictions, and the survivors gathered in the center of the hub with weary faces and hollow eyes. "We have received confirmation that rescue ships have been dispatched," Dravith announced, and a ripple of relief passed through the crowd. "However, they will not arrive for another 2 weeks, and our supplies are critically low." He paused, and his gaze swept across the assembled colonists. "I am therefore implementing additional restrictions on non-contributing members, and their rations will be reduced to 1/3 of standard allocation, effective immediately." Murmurs of shock and protest rose from the crowd, and Seojin felt her stomach clench because she knew what 1/3 rations meant. It meant slow starvation for those who were already weak before anyone else could respond. A small figure pushed through the crowd and climbed onto a storage crate so that everyone could see him. It was Tavu, and his fur was bristled with determination, and his eyes blazed with righteous anger. "No," he said, and his young voice carried across the hub with surprising strength. "I will not allow this." Dravith stared at the cub with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "This is not a matter for children to decide." "Then make me an adult," Tavu shot back, "because I have seen more in the past 4 weeks than most adults see in a lifetime, and I've learned what real courage looks like, and it does not look like letting good people starve." He pointed at Seojin, who stood at the edge of the crowd with her bandaged hands and her too thin frame. "That human broke her bones for us," Tavu said. "She went into the heating core when no one else could, and she held that beam for 12 minutes, while her body froze and her shoulder dislocated and her ribs cracked under the pressure." His voice grew louder and more passionate with every word. "We listened to her scream through the communicator, and we heard every sound of her suffering, and she did not let go because she knew that if she did, we would all die." The crowd had gone completely silent, and even Dravith seemed frozen by the cub's words. "And now you want to take her food away," Tavu continued, "because she cannot work while she heals from the injury she got saving your lives." He looked around at the assembled colonists, and his gaze was challenging and fierce. "Where is your honor, and where is your gratitude, and where is the Qurani tradition that says we repay our debts?" A new voice spoke up, and everyone turned in shock because it was Myray, the silent one, who had barely spoken 10 words since the explosion. "I have kept count," she said, and her voice was clear and precise. "Yoon Seojin has given away 47 ration packs since the rationing system began, and she has eaten only 19 meals in 28 days. She pulled a small data pad from her pocket, and she held it up for everyone to see. She worked 162 hours of repair duty in the first 2 weeks, and she volunteered for 12 outside missions in temperatures that would have killed any Qurani. Murray's eyes swept across the crowd, and they lingered on Dravith with an expression that was almost accusatory. "She shared her heating allocation with us from the first night, and she gave us her jacket and her blankets, and she went cold so that we could be warm." The colonists were shifting uncomfortably now, and many of them were looking at Seojin with new understanding in their eyes. And then Lil Haniel stepped forward, and she walked across the hub with her small legs carrying her toward Commander Dravisher. Stopped in front of him, and she reached into her pocket and she pulled out her ration pack, and she placed it at his feet. "I am not hungry," she said in her small voice. "Give it to Seojin, mother." The word hit the assembly like a thunderbolt. Seojin, mother. In Qurani tradition, there was a custom called adoption by deed, where one who saves a life becomes kin to the one they saved. By calling Seojin mother, Haniel had invoked that ancient tradition, and she had declared before the entire colony that this human woman was her familiar. Teivu jumped down from his crate, and he walked to stand beside his sister, and he added his own ration pack to the pile. "She is our mother now," he said. "She earned that title with her blood and her pain and her unbroken will." Myra joined him silently, and she placed her ration back with the others. For a moment, nothing happened, and then an elderly Karani scientist limped forward on his broken leg, and he was the one Seijin had shared her rations with, and he added his pack to the growing pile. "She fed me when I could not feed myself," he said. "I will not forget." Another colonist stepped forward, and then another, and then a dozen more. And the pile of ration packs grew and grew until it seemed like half the colony had contributed. Ref stood frozen as his authority crumbled around him, and he watched his people reject his cold mathematics in favor of something he had never accounted for: loyalty and love and the fierce protective bonds that form when people suffer together. "You have a choice, Commander," Teivu said, and despite his youth, his voice carried the weight of a leader. "You can enforce your system and tear this colony apart, or you can admit that your equations forgot to include the most important variable." Drevith looked at the pile of ration packs, and he looked at the three cubs standing united before him, and he looked at Seojin, who had tears streaming down her face. "And what variable is that?" he asked quietly. "The variable that says some things are worth more than survival," Teivu replied. "Things like honor and compassion and standing by the people who stood by you." The silence stretched for a long moment, and then Dravith's shoulders sagged, and something in his expression shifted like ice cracking under the first warmth of spring. "The rationing changes are suspended," he said. "We will distribute resources equally until rescue arrives." Cheer went up from the crowd, and the cubs ran to Seojin, and they threw their arms around her, and she held them and cried and laughed. At the same time, that night when the hub was quiet and most of the colonists were sleeping, Teivu lay beside Seojin, and he whispered something in formal Kareni. "It was a vow, and it was ancient, and it was binding. When I am grown," he said, "I will find Earth, and I will tell them what their daughter did, and I will make sure no human ever stands alone as she did." Seojin stroked his fur gently, and she thought about how much had changed since that first terrible day. "You are already remarkable, Teivu," she said. "You do not need to prove anything to anyone." "I am not doing it to prove something," he said. "I am doing it because it is right." In the morning, a signal came through on the emergency channel. Rescue ships had been dispatched, and they were making better time than expected, but they were still 2 weeks away, and the colony's oxygen recyclers were starting to fail. The cold inside the heating core was a living thing, and it wrapped around Seojin like the coils of some ancient serpent, and it squeezed the warmth from her body with patient hunger. She had stopped feeling her hands after the first 3 minutes, and now at 12 minutes into her ordeal, she was not sure she could feel anything at all except the fire in her shoulder where something had cracked and shifted out of place. The Karani welders worked frantically around her, and their tools sparked and hissed as they tried to secure the failing beam, and every few seconds one of them would retreat gasping and shaking as the cold overwhelmed their thin blood. Seojin held her position, and she did not move, and she did not let go. Her mind drifted in the cold, and she thought about her brother Ji-hoon, and she remembered the day he died, and how she had been on the other side of the planet when it happened, and how she had not even gotten to say goodbye. She thought about the 3 cubs who were waiting for her outside, and she imagined Hanuel's face if she did not come back, and she felt something fierce and stubborn rise up inside her chest. Not yet, she told herself, and she pushed back against the darkness that was creeping into the edges of her vision. The lead welder shouted something in Karani, and then there was a final burst of sparks, and suddenly the beam was secure, and hands were grabbing at her arms and pulling her toward the exit. She collapsed the moment she was out of the core, and her legs simply stopped working, and she fell onto the floor of the corridor, and she lay there gasping for breath that burned like fire in her lungs. Someone was shouting for medical help, and someone else was wrapping thermal blankets around her, and voices swirled above her in a confusing mix of Qurani and Standard. The diagnosis came later, when she was lying in the medical bay with her body wrapped in heating pads and her hands submerged in warming solution, dislocated shoulder, and 3 cracked ribs from the pressure of holding the beam, and severe frostbite on both hands and mild frostbite on her face and feet. The colony's medical supplies were limited, and the doctor who treated her was honest about the situation. "We can set the shoulder and bind the ribs," he said, "but we do not have the medication to properly treat the frostbite, and you may lose some function in your fingers." Seojin nodded because she had expected as much. "Just do what you can," commanded Dravith. Came to visit her that evening, and he stood at the foot of her bed, and he looked at her with an expression she could not read. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. "Why?" he finally asked, and his voice was quiet and stripped of its usual authority. "Why did you do it?" "Because it needed to be done," Seojin said. "That is not an answer," Dravith said. "Any of us might have died for that reason alone, but you did not hesitate, and you did not complain, and you held that beam for 12 minutes when even 5 would have killed most." "Kurani." Seojin looked at him, and she saw that he was genuinely confused, and she realized that he truly did not understand. "There are children depending on me," she said, "and as long as there is breath in my body and strength in my bones, I will protect them, because that is what humans do." Dravith was silent again, and then he did something that surprised her completely. He bowed his head in the Qurani gesture of deep respect, and he held that position for a full count of 10 before straightening. "I have misjudged your kind," he said. "I called you fragile and sentimental, and I dismissed your compassion as weakness, but I was wrong." He turned and walked to the door, and he paused there with his hand on the frame. "The heating system is repaired because of what you did tonight," he said, without looking back. "The colony survives because you chose to break rather than let us freeze." Then he was gone, and Seojin was left alone with the humming of the medical equipment and the slow throb of pain in her shoulder. She was almost asleep when she heard the door open again, and small footsteps padded across the floor. Toward her bed, she opened her eyes and saw 3 cubs standing in a row beside her, and Tevoo had tears streaming down his face, and Mireille was clutching a small bundle in her arms, and Haniel was already climbing onto the bed despite the protests of the medical equipment. "We heard everything," Tevoo said, and his voice cracked with emotion. "We had a communicator, and we heard you scream when your bones broke." "I am sorry," Seojin said, and she reached out her bandaged hand to touch his face. "I did not want you to hear that." "Do not be sorry," Tevoo said fiercely. "Do not ever be sorry for being brave." Haniel had curled herself against Seojin's uninjured side, and her small body was warm and solid and comforting. "Don't break anymore," littlest cub whispered, and her voice was thick with fear. "Please, Seojin, don't break anymore." Seojin felt tears sliding down her own cheeks, and she wrapped her arm around Haniel and held her close. "I will try, little one," she said. "I will try." Mireille stepped forward, and she placed her bundle on the bed, and Seojin saw that it was a collection of ration packs carefully saved and hoarded. "These are for you," Mireille said, and it was the first time the silent cub had spoken more than 2 words since the explosion. "You need to eat so you can heal." Seojin looked at the ration packs, and she looked at the 3 cubs who had given up their own food for her, and she felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with her. "Cracked ribs. Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you all." That night, the cubs stayed with her in the medical bay, and they piled onto the narrow bed around her like a litter of puppies seeking warmth, and Seojin held them all, and she listened to their breathing slow as they drifted off to sleep. Tevoo was the last one awake, and he lay with his head on her uninjured shoulder, and he stared at the ceiling with those two old eyes. "When I grow up," he said softly, "I am going to find Earth, and I am going to tell them about you and what you did for us." "You do not have to do that," Seojin said. "Yes, I do," Tebu said, and there was steel in his young voice. "Someone has to make sure that humans know how much they matter, and I'm going to be that someone." He fell asleep before Sanjing could respond, and she lay awake for a long time afterward, and she thought about promises and sacrifices and the strange paths that life could take. In the morning, she learned that the heating system was working, but a new crisis had emerged. Her injuries meant she could no longer do the physical work that had earned her extra rations and underpurse. Dravis' contribution-based system that meant her food allocation would be cut to cuts understood what this meant before anyone explained it to them, and Tevu began planning something that would change everything. 2 weeks into the crisis, and the colony hub had become a desperate refuge where warmth was more valuable than gold. Seojin watched the survivors huddle together in small groups, and she saw how the cold was wearing them down day by day, and she saw how fear was turning neighbors into strangers. The Karani were suffering badly because their bodies were not made for this kind of cold, and even with the heating system partially repaired, the temperature stayed low enough to make their blood sluggish and their movements slow. Commander Dravith called a meeting in the center of the hub, and everyone gathered to hear what he had to say. "We must face reality," he announced, and his voice carried the weight of authority even as his breath misted in the cold air. "Our supplies will not last 6 weeks if we continue as we are." Seojin felt her stomach tighten because she knew where this was going. "I am implementing a contribution-based rationing system," Dravith continued. "Those who can work and contribute to our survival will receive full rations, and those who cannot will receive half." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and some voices agreed, and some protested. But Dravith raised his hand for silence. "This is not cruelty," he said. "This is mathematics, and mathematics does not care about our feelings." Seojin stepped forward, and every eye in the room turned to her. "And what about the children?" she asked. "What about the elderly and the injured who cannot work through no fault of their own?" Dravith met her gaze without flinching. "They will receive half rations as the system dictates. Half rations will kill them slowly," Seojin said, and her voice rose with anger. "You are sentencing them to death with extra steps. I am giving us all the best chance to survive," Dravith replied. "Your human sentiment blinds you to the necessity of hard choices. There are other options," Seojin insisted. "The ice forms that live beneath the surface are edible, and the geothermal vents to the north could provide additional heat. And if we all shared equally, instead of punishing the vulnerable, we could stretch our supplies further." Dravith shook his head. "The ice forms are dangerous to hunt, and the vents are too far away. An equal rationing would weaken our workers and doom us all. So instead, you choose to sacrifice children. I choose to save the majority," Dravith said, and there was no apology in his voice. "This is how Karani have survived for 10,000 years. And we do not let emotion override logic." Seojin wanted to argue more, but she saw the faces around her, and she saw that many of them agreed with their commander, and she realized that words alone would not win this battle. She returned to the corner where the 3 cubs waited, and she sat down beside them, and she tried to keep the despair off her face. Tevu looked at her with knowing eyes. "We are the ones who will get half rations." "Yes," Seojin said, because she would not lie to him. "Then we will be hungry." "No," Seojin said, and she made it a promise. "I will not let that happen." That night, she gave her entire ration pack to the cubs, and she told them she had already eaten. When they asked why she was not joining them, Tevu did not believe her, but Hanuel was too hungry to question, and Mireille watched everything with those silent, observant eyes that seemed to record every detail. Next day, Seojin ate nothing, and she worked twice as hard to distract herself from the hunger that gnawed at her belly. She volunteered for every difficult task, and she repaired broken systems, and she helped seal new cracks in the walls where the cold was seeping through, and she earned extra ration packs that she gave away to the cubs and to the elderly. Karani scientist with the broken leg, who had also been condemned to half rations by the end of the first week of rationing, Seojin had lost weight that she could not afford to lose, and her hands shook sometimes when she worked, and her vision blurred at the edges when she stood up too fast, but the cubs were fed, and that was what mattered. Tevu confronted her on the 8th night when she handed over her ration. "Pack again. You are not eating," he accused, and his young voice was fierce with worry. "I am not stupid, and I can see what you are doing." Seojin tried to smile. "I'm fine, and humans can go longer without food than Karani." "That is a lie," Tevu said. "I have studied humans in school, and I know that you need to eat just like everyone else." Seojin sat down heavily, and she realized that she was too tired to keep up the pretense. "I had a brother," she said softly. "His name was Jihoon, and he was younger than me, and he always gave his dessert to the other children in our building, even when he was hungry himself." Tevu listened with wide eyes as she continued. "He died 3 years ago in an accident, and I was not there to protect him, and I have carried that guilt with me every day since." She looked at the 3 cubs, and she saw her brother in their faces, and she saw every child she had ever failed to save. "Humans are stubborn about protecting children," she said. "It is in our bones, and it is in our blood, and I could not live with myself if I let you go hungry while I had food to give." Tevu was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her hand in his small clawed grip. "Then we will share," he said. "You eat half, and we eat half, and that way nobody starves alone." Seojin felt tears prick at her eyes, and she squeezed his hand gently. "You are a good cub, Tevu." The cold deepened as the days passed, and the Karani began showing signs of hypothermia, and their movements became sluggish, and their thoughts became slow. Seojin, with her human biology adapted to Earth's variable climate, handled it better than most, and she took on more and more of the physical work that the Karani could know longer manage. She volunteered for outside repair work in temperatures that would kill a Karani in minutes, and she earned extra rations that she distributed to the most vulnerable survivors, and she pushed her body further than it was meant to go. Commander Dravith watched her work, and something in his expression began to shift, though he said nothing. On the 14th day, the crisis reached a breaking point. A structural beam in the heating core was failing, and if it collapsed, the entire system would shut down and everyone would freeze to death within hours. Someone had to go into the core and hold the beam in place while others welded it secure, but the temperature inside the core was lethal to Karani within minutes. Yijin stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "I will do it." She Sadraith stared at her. "You will die." "Maybe," Seojin said. "But if nobody does it, we all die for certain." She looked back at the 3 cubs who were watching from across the hub, and she saw Tevu's face go pale with understanding. "Take care of them if I do not come back," she told Dravith, and then she walked toward the heating core without waiting for his answer. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she entered, and she felt her lungs burn with each breath, and she felt her skin go numb almost immediately. But she found the failing beam, and she braced her back against it, and she held on with everything she had. The Karani welders worked in 30-second shifts, and they moved as fast as they could, but time stretched into an eternity of cold and pain. 1 minute passed, and then 2. And then 5. Seojin's fingers went completely numb, and she could no longer feel her feet, and frostbite was setting into her exposed skin. 8 minutes in, and something in her shoulder gave way with a crack that echoed through the chamber, and she screamed, but she did not let go. Somewhere outside the core, 3 cubs listened through a stolen communicator, and they heard every sound of her suffering, and they made a promise in their hearts that they would never forget what she was willing to endure for them. The explosion came without warning, and it tore through the mining colony like the fist of an angry guardian. Seojin felt the floor buckle beneath her feet, and she grabbed the nearest support beam as the world turned to fire and screaming metal. Around her, she'd lived on Volrath 4 for 2 years now, and she had learned to respect the ice world and its dangers, but nothing had prepared her for this moment when the mining drill's power core decided to rupture and take 12 colonists with it into the darkness. The alarms screamed their warnings too late as always, and Seojin pulled herself up from the floor and started moving toward the central hub, where the survivors would gather. Her training kicked in without thought, and she began sealing bulkheads behind her as she moved, and she checked each section for survivors, and she kept her breathing steady even as the temperature began to drop around her. The Karani colonists were already panicking when she reached the hub, and she understood why, because their thin blood would freeze at temperatures that humans found merely uncomfortable, and the explosion had damaged the heating system badly. Commander Dravis stood in the center of the chaos, and he was trying to bring order to the frightened survivors, but his voice was lost in the noise of crying and shouting and the constant wail of emergency systems. Seojin climbed onto a storage crate, and she put 2 fingers in her mouth, and she whistled so loud that everyone stopped and turned to look at her. "We need to seal off the damaged sections now," she called out, and her voice was calm and steady, and it cut through the panic like a blade through cloth. "Everyone who can work gather at the East Corridor, and we start there." Dravis looked at her with something between annoyance and relief, and he nodded once and began directing the able-bodied colonists toward the East Corridor. Seojin worked for 6 hours straight, and she sealed bulkheads and rerouted power conduits, and she checked every system she could reach, and slowly the temperature in the central hub stabilized at a level that was cold but survivable. When she finally stopped to rest, she realized that 34 colonists had made it to the hub out of the 50 who had called this frozen rock home, and she said a quiet word for the 16 who had not been so lucky. It was during her brief rest that she heard the sound, and it was soft and muffled, but her ears caught it anyway, because it was the sound of a child crying. She followed the sound to a storage compartment near the back of the hub, and she opened the door slowly, and she found them huddled together in the darkness. 3 Karani cubs with their fur pressed flat against their bodies from fear, and their large eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. The eldest was maybe 8 cycles old by Karani counting, and he had positioned himself in front of his siblings with his small claws extended in a gesture that was brave and heartbreaking. At the same time, "It is okay," Seojin said softly, and she crouched down to make herself smaller and less threatening. "I am not going to hurt you." "Mother said to wait here," the eldest cub said, and his voice trembled, but he did not lower his claws. "She said she would come back." Seojin felt her heart crack a little because she had seen the casualty reports, and she knew the names of those who had died in the explosion, and she recognized the family name of these 3 cubs. Their parents had been working in the drill chamber when the core ruptured, and they were never coming back. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Tevu," the eldest said. "These are my siblings, Mireille and Haniel." The middle cub Mireille watched Seojin with eyes that saw too much for a child of 6 cycles, and the youngest, Haniel, had buried her face in her brother's fur, and she was the one who had been crying. "I am Sanjin," she said, "and I need you to come with me to where the other survivors are because it is warmer there and safer." Tevu shook his head stubbornly. "Mother said to wait." Seojin closed her eyes for a moment, and she thought about her own brother who had died 3 years ago in a construction accident on Earth, and she remembered how she had waited by the hospital door for hours because she could not believe he was really gone. "Sometimes," she said very softly, "the people we love cannot come back even when they want to more than anything in the universe. And when that happens, we have to take care of each other in their place." Taivu's claws slowly retracted and his brave face crumbled, and he was just a scared child again. "They're not coming back," he whispered, and it was not a question. "No," Seojin said. "I am so sorry, but no they are not." Hanyul began to cry harder, and Mireille wrapped her arms around her little sister, and Taivu stood frozen as the truth settled into his young bonus. Ajin opened her arms, and she waited, because she would not force them to come to her, but she would be there if they chose to. Taivu moved first, and he crashed into her chest, and his siblings followed, and Seojin held all three of them as they cried, and she let them grieve for as long as they needed. When they were ready, she carried Hanyul in her arms, and she led the other two by the hand, and she brought them to the central hub. Commander Dravis intercepted her immediately, and his expression was not pleased. "What is this?" he demanded. "We have limited resources, and these cubs are not essential personnel. They are children," Seojin said, and her voice went cold in a way that made several nearby Karani step back. "They just lost their parents." "Sentiment will not keep us alive," Dravis said. "The heating system is damaged and our food stores are limited, and rescue will not arrive for 6 standard weeks at minimum." "Then I will share my rations with them," Seojin said. "I will share my heating allocation, and they will take nothing from anyone else." Dravis stared at her for a long moment, and something in her eyes must have convinced him that arguing would be pointless, because he turned away with a dismissive wave of his clawed hand. "Do as you wish, human, but do not come to me when your foolish compassion costs you." Seojin led the cubs to a corner of the hub, and she made a nest of thermal blankets for them, and she gave Hanyul her own jacket, even though the cold immediately bit into her skin. Taivu watched her with those 2 old eyes that children get when the universe forces them to grow up too fast. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. "We are not your kind." Seojin smiled, and she reached out to smooth the fur on his head, the way she used to ruffle her brother's hair. "Because that is what humans do," she said. "We take care of the small ones, even when it costs us." That night, the food synthesizer failed, and Commander Dravis gathered the survivors to deliver the news. They had enough supplies for half of them to survive until rescue arrived, but only if difficult choices were made. Seojin looked at the 3 cubs sleeping in their nest of blankets, and she felt something hard and determined settle into her chest. She would not let them become one of those difficult choices, not while she still had breath in her body and strength in her bones.